Good evening. Everyone's doing well. Sean, good evening. How are you? It's going to be a huge topic tonight. I don't know how I'm going to condense everything within an hour time frame or an hour 15, but I'm going to try and do my best. I think this is a very important subject, actually, which is sorely misrepresented. Hey, Fire Pixie, good evening. Glad you can make it. Um, but this topic is sorely misrepresented by unfortunately, most people in the 9/11 truth movement and the skeptic community, very few people, and I think Sean could attest how the Afghanistan war, which basically was the pretext for radical fundamentalism that came after it. And 1979 is a huge year, and it basically replaced the threat of the Cold War with the new enemy, and that is the radical fundamentalism in the Salafist movement, which was precipitated by the intelligence services and uh, people in Washington and foreign policy advisors here and abroad took advantage of the enemy that we helped to create. And there's a lot of similarities between what is happening in Ukraine to Afghanistan, actually. And later on, I'll do my best to try and make sense of that. Think I mean, well, there we go, Mike, you made it. How about it? Good. I'm glad. Good evening. And I could go back and talk about the advent of after World War II and how the Soviet Union became a major player in geopolitics. I don't want to go back as far as that. We're going to try to keep it recent, and hopefully it makes sense to you at the end or during it. But throughout the 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, the United States basically tried to circumvent the Soviet Union by covert means, intelligence means, through the CIA, um, through their foreign policy advisors, to try and upend the Soviet Union. And throughout the 1960s, the Afghan army, under the orders of Daoud Khan, president of Afghanistan, made two unsuccessful incursions into Pakistan's Banjur district. Now, Pakistan is seen as an ally to the United States. And so Pakistan was more worried about um, Afghanistan under influence of Soviet Union, who at the time, Dawood Khan and other leaders of Afghanistan build trade relations throughout the 1960s and 70s. And basically, the Soviet Union tried to make a power play. Now, just to 100 couple of kilometers to its east, um, you basically have one of the most prized possessions of the Middle East, and that would be the Caspian Sea. And so, I'm sorry, to the west of it, not to the east. So this is basically the largest untapped oil reserves in the world, and the United States would understand what was at play here because throughout World War II, oil was seen as the reason for success of the West and the coalition partners like Great Britain, France. This helped during the air war, the sea. Oil was a huge motivating factor in defeating the Nationalist Socialists of Germany. And so, with the Caspian Sea at play here, which is one of the primary factors of why we're actually going to engage in this conflict, um, is so enormously important here. So, the damaged Afghanistan economy under Dawood's regime was pushed towards an alliance with the Soviet Union for trade. However, these stopgap measures were not enough to compensate the loss suffered under Afghanistan's own woeful economy because of the border closures that were happening. And as a result of the continued resentment against Dawood's autocratic rule, and Mohammed Dawood was seen as an innovator, but because he basically was not a friend to, say, the Pashtuns, the natives of the country, he basically was suffering twofold here. The economy was damaged, and he's trying to build trade relations with the Soviet Union, which would go back and cause damage to his own populace. Now, during the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s, the Soviet Union was becoming more engaged with the country of Afghanistan. And the United States was very worried about this. Um, but they weren't the only ones. In 1976, there's very few documentation about this group I'm going to mention. So, what I'm going to use are books that I've read, one being Devil's Game: How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamental Islam by Robert Dreyfus, where they talk about the Safari Club. Very few people talk about the Safari Club. So in 1976, during the fall, Prince Turki Al Faisal, who's the head of the Saudi intelligence, the General Intelligence Directorate, gave a speech in the United States in the year 2002. And he would later be quoted as, quote, in 1976, after the Watergate matters took place here, your intelligence community was literally tied up by Congress. It could not do anything. It could not send spies, could not write reports, and it could not pay money. In order to compensate for that, a group of countries got together in the hope of fighting communism and established what was called the Safari Club. The Safari Club included France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and Iran. End quote. During the same time, there was a primary ideology that was encompassing the Middle East, but it was waning, and that is Arab nationalism, which was precipitated under the late Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser, that basically tried to enlighten the Muslim community and strengthen trade with countries like Russia, or at the time Soviet Union, China, Great Britain. The United States saw this as a threat as well. So, in essence, the United States basically saw that the Middle East, which was basically growing under the advent of Arab nationalism, countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, and Syria, countries that were enjoying a Western lifestyle similar to it. There was no women wearing niqabs or hijab. There was no threat of radical fundamentalists, if you will. They were kept in jails in Egypt and Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. However, what was happening was a brewing problem. Is that because of these very authoritarian regimes under Assad in Syria and under Sadat in Egypt and Nasser before him, we were seeing a growing resentment toward the state by these radical fundamentalist groups that were in prison, that were in the shadows. And at the same time, you have the Soviet Union trying to coordinate more power structure in the Middle East to grow enough to where it extends into the Caspian Sea. And so the Safari Club basically was led by Alexandre de Marchas, who was the head of the French External Intelligence Service, the SDECE, which was the chief instigator of the group, in which millions of dollars of covert money are spent to create staff, offices, communications, and operational capabilities to basically circumvent communism. At the same time, countries like Algeria, which was uh, under a renaissance of sorts with the French, basically were taking away jobs from native Algerians. This too will come into play. Iran, under the Western backed leader Revli Pahlavi, also known as the Shah of Iran, who is basically governing the country because the CIA back in 1953 helped to overthrow the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, which led to the implementation of Reva Pahlavi. And all these countries basically were becoming democratic socialist under the influence of Arab nationalism and communism. Even though Arab nationalism and communism did not coexist, but at the same time, there was no real conflict. Now, what was happening was a couple of years later, in 1977, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor under the US president back then, Jimmy Carter, would form a group called the Nationalities Working Group, which was dedicated to the idea of weakening the Soviet Union by inflaming ethnic tensions in Afghanistan. Because the White House saw the threat of the Soviet Union under a number of different Soviet influenced leaders like Hafizullah Amin, Mohammad Daoud Khan, Nur Muhammad Taraki, basically expanding into the country. And Pakistan, which was an ally to the United States, saw the threat and saw that they were next. At the time, Pakistan didn't have a very formidable army. Neither did Saudi Arabia or the Gulf at the time. And so at the time, Soviet Union was still a major player. And the United States saw the threat. Years later, um, Zbigniew Brzezinski would write a book called The Grand Chessboard, in which he regarded the basis of the book is regarding the landmass of Eurasia. Eurasia being the encompassing all of Europe and Asia, meaning Eurasia, in which Brzezinski set out to formulate a Eurasian geostrategy for the United States. And in particular, he writes that no Eurasian challenger should emerge that could dominate Europe and South and Asia, and thus challenge the United States for global preeminence, with the Caspian Sea as the prize result. And much of Brzezinski's analysis is concerned with the geostrategy in Central Asia, focusing on the exercise of power on the Eurasian landmass in a post Soviet environment. And because of this, Brzezinski influenced the Carter administration to take advantage and basically try to circumvent the Soviet Union. Now, what Brzezinski was trying to do here to try and make it less difficult for you to listen is that he wanted to inflame the Islamic populations that were in Afghanistan that were suffering under the leadership of Hafizullah Amin, who replaced Daoud. Daoud was actually executed by Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki under, at the time, what was called the SAR Revolution, led by the Republic of Afghanistan. Now, what's the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan? Well, they were a one-party rule which lasted from 1978 to 1992, and it relied heavily on the assistance from the Soviet Union for most of its existence, especially during the upcoming war. Now, I'm not going to be saying Democratic Republic of Afghanistan all the time. I'm going to be calling them the PDPA. Now, they came to power through the SAR revolution. Now, the SAR revolution happened in April of 1978, in which the People's Democratic Party, the PDPA, overthrew Mohammed Daoud Khan, who he himself had taken power during the 1973 coup d'etat and established an autocratic one party system in the country, not knowing that the people that served under him, like Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki, would basically come back and kill him and take over the country. The PDPA, which basically came under power in 1973, came into real power in 1978. And that happened on April 27th, 1978. Hafizul Amin, Nur Muhammad Taraki took over the country, and they were far more brutal to the Pashtuns, the Islamic community, than their predecessor, Daoud Khan, who basically was seen as an innovator, still a socialist, but still as an innovator in the country, working with the Pashtuns. But these people basically slaughtered tens of thousands of native Afghans. This embroiled a large response by the Islamic community in whole. And basically, what happened was the United States saw this and basically used this as a pretext to inflame the Afghan and Islamic community, also known as the Ummah, Arabic for Islamic community, and basically wanted to use this opportunity to basically destroy the Soviet Union. And so Brzezinski, under this new geostrategic plan, basically came into contact with Richard Pipes, who's the father of Daniel Pipes. Now, for those who don't know who Richard Pipes is, he's an American academic who specialized in Russian and Soviet history and basically uh, created a group called Team B, which composed of civilian experts and retired military officers, and which was influenced by the CIA under then the director George H.W. Bush, which basically talked about the circumvention of the Soviet Union. And guess who was the instigation of the creation of Team B? Now, I don't want to ruin it yet because what I want to tell you is this: the reason why I'm talking about this event tonight, a lot of these people that I'm going to be naming tonight would have a reverberating effect to the areas that I talk about and that you're familiar with. People like Osama bin Laden, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, George H.W. Bush, um, Abdullah Yusuf Azam. And a lot of these people are basically going to have a lasting effect throughout the 1990s. Ramzi Youssef, for example, throughout the 1990s, and of course, 2001. This is the reason why I'm talking about this subject. But the primary instigator, the creator of Team B, was not only Daniel Pipes, but the future Secretary of Defense under the Bush administration, Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was an antagonizing force to the group of Team B and CIA intelligence officials who created their own group called Team A. Rumsfeld would his hope was that it would produce a much more aggressive assessment of their outline of the Soviet Union's military capabilities in Afghanistan for the war that they're going to help to create for them. Now, um, Unsurprisingly, uh, the plan argued that the national intelligence estimate on the Soviet Union, which is generated yearly by the CIA, underestimated the Soviet Union's strategy and ambition. And this would be felt right off the bat during the war because Afghanistan was sorely lacking in a lot of areas, especially air power. But that would change later on. So, according to Richard Dreyfuss' book that I mentioned before, Richard Cotton, who's a former CIA official, advised the Carter administration at this time that the Iranians were about to overthrow the Shah of Iran. 1979 would become the one of the biggest years in world history, not just American history, but world history, because of what was going to come. Not what was happening at the time, but what was going to come for the future. In other words, from one enemy, which was the Soviet Union in the Cold War, we would be engaging a new enemy, and that would be the Allies during this time for the United States, and that is radical fundamentalism, radical Islamic fundamentalism, precipitated by the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf. Billions and billions of dollars would be poured into these factions that would come back to haunt us in the future. Now, in 1979, early 1979, the CIA begins a covert action against the communist government in Afghanistan. Now, this is before the war. So they were, in other words, the United States knew what they were going to do, knew that they were going to instigate a war with Russia. So, in other words, most historians will tell you that the war started on, you know, November November of 1979. But that wasn't the case because it started long before that. And it's funny because history has a way of not telling you the truth, but is not solely based on all lies. And this is the problem with the United States in general, right? The powers that be, they don't outright tell you a lie, but they skew the vision of the mindset of the American populace in a way that you don't know what is the truth. You don't know what is a lie, but you know something is off. And time is of the essence because you're trying to figure out what is the lie and what is the truth, while much of history is hidden from you. That's why they classify these documents in human history in 40, 50 years. But by that time, all the major players of those events are dead. You can't hold them accountable. So the United States began to covert action against the communist government under Hafizul Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki. Robert Gates, who will become the CIA director after George H.W. Bush, would recall during a meeting in March 30th, 1979, that the Undersecretary of Defense, Walter Slocum, wondered aloud whether there was a value in keeping the Afghan insurgency going. And according to Robert Gates, he quoted the very famous quote that what he wanted was to suck the Soviets into a Vietnamese quagmire. So, in other words, he wanted to create. Now, Brzezinski would later on and use it as a different quote, saying that they'll give the Soviet Union their own version of the Vietnam War. And generally, he was right. Now, the United States can't come right out and say that they're supporting Afghanistan insurgents because that would precipitate World War III. They have to do it covertly. They can't announce it. So, what they started to do in 1978 in 1979, the early months of 1979, was that they were working with the Pakistan Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, also known as the ISI, a very nefarious intelligence organization, one of the oldest in the world. And also to this day, there has been no captured ISI intelligence officer ever that has been reported, which is unreal. Just goes to show you. And I did an article 2 years ago talking about the ISI and the history thereof. And basically, they are undergoing a transformation of their own. Pakistan is the second largest percentage of Muslims in the world, and also the ideology, which is a very brutal interpretation of Salafism, also known as Wahhabism, that was permeated in the ISI. In fact, the CIA would later complain and say that the ISI was two organizations into one. One was an intelligence organization, and the other was they were radical fundamentalists, in which they were under then Director General Hamid Go. And basically, the CIA couldn't really trust the ISI, even though they were allies, but they kept their distance. The Pakistan, just to show you how nefarious this group is, the ISI would later create a fundamentalist group all on their own called the Jama Islamiyah, which basically was to fight against Indian separatists for control of Kashmir and Lahore. So, in other words, they would help to create this group to basically try to kill off as many Indian separatists and intelligence officers for control of Kashmir and Lahore. Later on, the Pakistan SI would also be found guilty of creating what we know as the Taliban. There's a lot of fact to this. It's not speculation. Um, the CIA would basically be ho hum about it, but they didn't reject uh, this idea or notion that the Pakistan ISI basically helped to facilitate the growth of the Taliban, which was to fight the communist forces in the 1990s after the war was over. So this way, Afghanistan would be kept in control of Pakistan. So let's continue. 1979 would see a huge, and I mean just a monumentous change. So what happened? The the president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, would basically state that there was. I'll read you just a quote. The quote is, "quote An arc of crisis stretches along the shores of the Indian Ocean, with fragile social and political structures in a region of vital importance to us, not to Afghans, to us, threatened with fragmentation. The resulting political chaos could well be filled by elements hostile to our values, not the Afghans, and sympathetic to our adversaries. And who would those adversaries be? Saudi Arabia and the West." End quote. Now, that's in a Time article dated January 8, 1979, that I'm reading from, well before the war started. So, in other words, the United States saw this as a war of their own. And basically, this caught the ire of the Islamic fundamentalist movement. In 1979, in July of 1979, the Central Intelligence Agency began what would be called, and still is, the largest, most successful operation they've ever had and they ever constructed. It's called Operation Cyclone. It began in July, I don't know the date, July 1979 to 1992. Prior and during the military intervention by the Soviet Union in support of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. In other words, they were going to use they couldn't by the way, this operation was very covert and had to be this way. Like I said before, they couldn't allow the Soviet Union to know that they were helping the Afghans in this war because that would start World War III. I don't need to remind you that we came close to complete catastrophe in 1982. But thanks to a Soviet general in a submarine, he did not engage US submarines in a nuclear battle. Now, the program led by the CIA leaned heavily towards supporting militant Islamic groups that I told you that Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted to inflame and assist in helping get rid of the Soviet influence in the country. And they knew what they were doing. The CIA knew, and they called them rebels. Sounds familiar? It's what we called the Salafists and jihadists in Syria, in which we also used a CIA program called Timber Sycamore to help overthrow Bashar al-Assad. There's a lot of similarities, past and present, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like a reciprocating, line of history. There's a great book by Thomas Ligotti called the I forgot the name of the book. Um, Something of the human race. I damn it, I love this book too, and my mind is shot. So this great book, it talks about Ligotti's theory that we'll just end up in a loop, this disastrous loop of repeating history, and we can't get out of this loop. Very depressing book. Don't read it. Very depressing book, but it really is something. It's very demented book, man. It is really out there. Anyway, the CIA basically were going to fund these groups through the Pakistan ISI, who has a relationship with some of these groups, right? And they could coexist. ISI speaks Arabic and Farsi, and they have a connection with the Pashtun community as well. And there's a religion that is permeating with Afghanistan that will later become the primary religion of Afghanistan called Hanafi, which is a little bit different than Wahhabism. Relating to the Orthodox school of Sunni jurisprudence, which is basically prevalent in the Philippines, Indonesia, southern and central Asia, which Afghanistan's a part. And later on, this would become the primary ideology in Afghanistan, even to this day, still is. Anyway, the program is the most expensive program in CIA history ever undertaken. And there is no definitive number. It's anywhere between uh, 865 million to like $4 billion or something like that. There's no pinpoint, but the amount of money and weapons that went through Pakistan, that went through these groups, is just a disaster. Sound familiar? That's exactly what's happening in Ukraine currently. And who are we giving these weapons to? Radical right wing separatists. That's who. In this case, with Afghanistan, they're radical right wing religious fundamentalists, right? The CIA has a long history of supporting extreme right wing groups to upend socialists and libertarian movements in the Central America throughout the 1970s, Middle East in the 1980s, and Europe in the 1990s and the 2000s. And this would basically help to facilitate and coordinate the Islamic community as a whole in Afghanistan. And there was one person in particular that would have a strong and very influential voice that would grab the attention of a more nefarious group. And these would be called the Takfiri. And these are the Arab fundamentalist groups. Now you have Afghans, fundamentalists, who are far different than Arabs. And I'll do this real quick. Afghan and Arabs don't get along. Afghans are more battle worthy due to their generational history of warfare, which gave the country Afghanistan the nickname the graveyard of empires, because no foreign invader has ever defeated Afghanistan. Now, this person would be Abdullah Yusuf Azam. Yusuf Azam was a Palestinian imam who was going through his own civil war at the time in Jordan, in Egypt, which he later became a theological teacher of Islamic jurisprudence in Saudi Arabia and learned Wahhabism there, in which a student of his, who at the time was a nobody, but was influential in a construction magnate, and his name was Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was very captivated by Yusuf Azam. And at the time, bin Laden was a very impressionable, shy young man who lost his father in a plane accident. That's right, a plane accident. And later on, his older brother, Salim bin Laden, would also be killed in a plane accident in the United States. Something to think about. Nevertheless, Azam and bin Laden knew each other through their time in Saudi Arabia. But Azam had envisioned Afghanistan as the staging point for the Islamic Ummah to come as a whole and to unite under against the secular invader of the Soviet Union. And so he was invited to Pakistan by a very powerful warlord called Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. Sayyaf was considered one of the two most powerful warlords next to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Both of these Afghans warlords would basically allow Arabs to come into their ranks. Very few Afghan warlords, people like Yunus Khalis, Burhanuddin Rabbani, Ahmed Galani, they were basically sectarian, didn't like foreigners, and wanted Afghanistan to remain under the leadership of the Hanafi movement. What they feared was that the United States or non governmental organizations such as NGOs or the Arabs would come into play and take over the war, and they would become the primary factors in the war. No, this was a war seen by Afghans versus the Soviets. But Azam was respected. Even in Afghanistan, he was respected. And so Azam basically arrives in Pakistan with barely any money to his own pockets. He brought his wife and family with him. Abdul Rasul Sayyaf gave him board and gave him a job in a teaching facility there. And what was happening was through Operation Cyclone, the United States started sending millions of dollars of weapons and aid to the Pakistan ISI, and the ISI began training the Afghans, and then all of a sudden, a trickling of the Arabs that were coming. Azam used his voice to basically declare a jihad against the Soviet Union and communism. He saw the detrimental effects of socialism in Jordan, in Egypt, and he basically feared that the communists under the Soviet Union would destroy the Islamic school of thought. The United States saw this and basically using Operation Cyclone as the vehicle to send millions and millions and millions of dollars with the help of very sympathetic Saudi princes. Now, Saudi Arabia at the time was undergoing a huge financial resurgence through the oil boom of the mid 1970s. Now, why am I mentioning this country? Because Saudi Arabia is the foundation for the very ideology that would help to percolate and facilitate these radical fundamentalist groups that would come back to hurt us, called Wahhabism, founded by its founder, Muhammad ibn al Wahhab, in the 18th century, which basically came into contact with the leader of the Emirate of Diriyah at the time, which was the first Arab Saudi state under Muhammad ibn Saud. And so Wahhabi and Saud clans joined together to create the Emirate of Diriyah. And then later on, it would be named Saudi Arabia when they took over the country from the Ottomans and the Khazarites and the two cities of Najd and Hajj, creating what we know today as Saudi Arabia. When the United States got involved with the country because they regulate the oil since 1932 under Standard Oil, Saudi Arabia allowed the United States to regulate the oil market in the hopes of being the military that they don't have. Wahhabism then grew, and they grew exponentially under the oil boom in 1970s, early 1980s. And so Saudi Arabia began sending emissaries all throughout the world, creating madrasas, organizations that were influential to the ideology of Wahhabism, this very heretical sect and branch of Sunni Islam that is basically rejected by 90% of the Sunni school of Islam. They don't consider it part of the Quran. Wahhabism is basically under the precepts of a um, Hadith scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah, who influenced Wahhabism, Wahhab, Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, which created Wahhabism. It's a heretical sect, not Quranic at all. In fact, most of the Islamic world, through the Sunni and Shia branch, reject Saudi Arabia. This ideology was spread throughout Saudi Arabia and spread with the advent of this war. So when Saudi princes started donating millions of dollars to the war itself, it began creating groups in Afghanistan that would spread after the war was over. So basically, the United States mobilized their own movement, basically through the media and press, for the public to accept um, what was about to come. Remember, all wars have to be somewhat generally agreeable with the American populace, because one thing is universal: nobody really wants war. Only sociopaths, empaths, people not empathetic to human life want war. But on December 24th, 1979, when the Soviet Union saw what was happening under Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hafizul Amin, the generals in the Soviet Union went into the capital of Kabul and killed Hafizul Amin. When the United States saw this, it was their moment to declare war by using Operation Cyclone and the Pakistan ISI, with the help of the Gulf, to basically engage in an all out conflict with the Soviet Union. And what would happen was a very long and very arduous war that saw a slaughter by the Soviet army over the Afghan factions. They were not equipped to fight the Soviets in air power. Remember, the Afghans don't have much of a military, not much of any type of air force. And so this took a toll in the first 5 to 6 years on the Afghans. And so Abdullah Zam basically used his voice, like I said before, to invite the Arabs with the full permission of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who had the largest Afghan faction called the Hizb-e-Islami Army, and Abdul Rasul Sayaf, and later another Afghan warlord that would have a very reverberating effect, Jalaluddin Haqqani, who would create later on the Haqqani network, an offshoot of the Taliban. These three Afghan warlords out of the dozens were the only Afghan warlords that would allow the Arabs to come into their ranks and fight against the Soviets. Because the one thing the Afghans used to have a saying is that the Arabs were good at one thing, dying. And they were willing martyrs for the cause because they saw this as their own interpretation of jihad. What Abdullah Yusuf Azam spread was his own interpretation of defensive jihad, was that defensive jihad was not just about a spiritual battle that the Prophet Muhammad would talk about in the Quran. No, Azam basically said that the jihad is also outward, not to defeat the sins of mankind inward, but also to defeat the sinful elements outward in the world itself. And this resonated with the Arab community. And one thing about Abdullah Yusuf Azam, he's a great orator. And I have a couple of videos. I have to upload them on Odyssey because I can't upload them to YouTube because they consider it supporting radical fundamentalism. But you can hear him speak, and he's a very well read, literate person. I could see why there's an allure about him. Now, Abdul Rasul Sayyab was leading his own faction because he was the leading commander of the Northern Alliance, which was also led by another leader um, at the time, which was um, Ahmed Shah Massoud. Now, the Northern Alliance and other groups like Hizb-e Islami and all the other Afghan factions were working together in fighting against the Soviets with the help of the Pakistan ISI. Now, the Saudi kingdom had become quite enamored with Sayyaf due to his theological posturing over the 1980s. And when Azam reached Pakistan, he saw that there was an influx of Arabs coming into the country that were disorganized. And so Azam had an idea. He traveled to Saudi Arabia with Abdul Rasul Sayyaf because Sayyaf gave him legitimacy and weight because he was such a influential warlord. That the idea was to create a services bureau of sorts, buildings that would help facilitate the influx of Arabs that were coming into the country through means of preparing them for war. And he pitched the idea with another Algerian immigrant called Abdullah Anas. Algeria at this time was going through a civil war through radical fundamentalists against the socialist government there. Anas saw the jihad in Afghanistan and wanted to be a part of this jihad. And so Anas, Yusuf Azam, with the help of bin Laden's money, would create called the Maktab al-Khidmat, which is called the Afghan Services Bureau. It began as one building in Peshawar, Pakistan, under the supervision of Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, and later on became multiple buildings. And they would cater to a military committee, a media committee, a religious committee, a widows community, basically just filling in different areas that would basically help the recruitment and militarization of the Arabs that were coming in to fight against the Soviets in this war. And basically, with the help of bin Laden's money, bin Laden then traveled to Pakistan and began to use his father's construction company, the bin Laden Saudi group, to use his own money, his father's construction vehicles, to help build ditches and roads. And this helped with the allure of bin Laden. Here's a guy who doesn't need to help. He's a millionaire many times over. But yet he's willing to be absolutely more than willing to use his money to help in the fight against the Soviets. And he was seen as a pariah in the country. Now, at the same time, the Soviets bombing was incessant. Days, weeks of carpet bombing the mountainous sides of southern Afghanistan. When Reagan replaced Carter as the president of the United States, Reagan circumvented Operation Cyclone in that he invited Afghan warlords to his White House. And if you'll find it on Google Images, just Google Afghan warlords in the White House, you'll see that he has these, very war torn, battle weary Afghans in the White House living room. And to help bring us acceptance of this war, there was a famous movie that came out. I think it was 1983, 84, and that was Rambo Part 2 or Rambo Part 3, um, which basically uh, was about the war in Afghanistan. Sorry, it was Part 3. Um, so this would basically, bring about, a an acceptance of, and this was made, I think, I'm sorry, it was later than that. It was like 80. I saw it in the Ridgewood Theater, movie theater. I was living at the time, Ridgewood, Queens. 1987, I want to say 86, 87. I'm not too sure about the year, but it was about the war in Afghanistan. Hollywood, propaganda, pure propaganda. And Rambo's working with like the radical fundamentalists, right? He's friends with them. It's awesome because you could see like, here's this big roided up Sylvester Stallone, and he's using rocket propelled grenade launchers, fighting against the evil Soviets. A silly movie, but at the time was fucking great, right? At the time. Nevertheless, Reagan basically made a pact with the Afghans, and in it was a clause where they would send Stinger missiles to basically help in the fight against uh, the Soviet Air Force. And because of this, it turned the war, completely turned the war. So now, just picture it. All these Stinger missiles that were coming in through Pakistan, through the Golden Chain, using drug routes, and basically going through the Helmand province, which is the largest poppy field population on Earth, and through the ISI, basically gave these Stinger missiles to like these Arabs and Afghans. Now, later on, some of those Stinger missiles would be used. Now, it's not conspiracies, really happened. Later on, those Stinger missiles would be used to fight against the United States in Somalia. I'm not joking. That really happened. You ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down? They're using Stinger missiles, rocket propelled. That was from the United States. This is what happens when you give weapons. And by the way, in the clause, Reagan basically says at the end of the war, the Afghan warlords and Arabs have to give back all the Stinger missiles. Do you think really like that's going to happen? Right? Oh, you're going to promise, right? You're going to give it back to us? So they use this, by the way, to fight against the United States and Somalia. Um, just ridiculous. I don't know. Anyway, the United States saw the turn of the tide of the war. The Afghans turned the tide, and basically the Soviets were losing by 1986, 87. And um, this basically would lead to the Soviets to send an emissary group to Pakistan. And under Benazir Bhutto as the prime minister, the only woman prime minister of Pakistan at the time, to basically act as a mediator between Afghanistan, Soviet Union to broker a deal where they would cease military expenditures in the country and come to a peace agreement between Afghanistan and Soviet Union. Pakistan saw this as an opportunity to basically jump on this because of their fear with the Soviet Union that they were going to be next to be taken over and facilitated what would be called as the Russian Afghan Peace Treaty of 1989. And so what happened was after um, the leadership of the ISI and leadership of the Pakistan government basically agreed with the promotion of Mikhail Gorbachev to the president, I mean to general secretary of the Soviet Union. He wanted to change the domestic policy, and because he knew that the Soviet Union was now under economic collapse because they spent so much on the war that they destroyed their own country from within. And this basically confirmed that the United States gave exactly what Brzezinski and Team B under Donald Rumsfeld at the time, their own Vietnam. And it worked by giving military aid and training through the Pakistan SI to the Afghan and Arab fundamentalists. What the war basically did was destroy a large populace of the Afghans. And with this, created a vacuum for Arab fundamentalist groups to begin under with the help of the CIA's Operation Cyclone through the training of the ISI and the money from Saudi Arabia and the United States. Well, they began to leave Afghanistan because here you have a very fervent, radical mindset that doesn't know the off switch. Just like you have some US soldiers that return from Afghanistan and Iraq that come back to the United States and they don't have an off switch. Well, just imagine here you have a Arab mindset led by an ideology that percolates in their head that everybody is an enemy to Wahhabism. And not only that, you're giving these people money, military training, and then go back home. Well, it helped to create a new enemy. And a lot of these people like Ramzi Youssef, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who later would create the Islamic State and Iraq, which later became the Islamic State and the Levant. Jalaluddin Haqqani, which would later form the Haqqani network. Muhammad Mullah Omar, who would later become the leader of the Taliban. Azerbaijan Bajanic, who would later form a group called the Abu Sayyaf. Ridwan Isamuddin, also known as Hambali, who would later help to create Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia. And Osama bin Laden, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Dr. Saeed Imam al-Sharif, who are known as Takfiris, who are also Muslims, like the Wahhabis, who would declare other Muslims like Sufis, Shias as munafiq, which is fake Muslim. That's what a takfiri is. They label other Muslims as fake Muslims that are not part of the Wahhabi religion, also known as Salafism, would create Al Qaeda. These were all groups that didn't exist. These were all organizations that weren't created by the United States, but were helped born out of the funding and training to help defeat one enemy, thus creating an enemy unto themselves, replacing an old enemy, which lends credence to the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And later on, the people I mentioned all came from Afghanistan, Pakistan, through the auspices of the Maktab al-Khidmat, which basically was partly funded by CIA's Operation Cyclone. And the Maktab al-Khidmat extended into the United States, in Arizona, and New York. And so this ideology that was once non-existent before the war happened suddenly became prevalent in countries like the United States, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Egypt, Pakistan, Jordan, all the countries that were under Arab nationalism, which now was a dead ideology, replaced by radical fundamentalists who taught poverty stricken neighborhoods, which is where religious fundamentalism breeds because of illiteracy and ignorance. These groups that went back and said that the United States was the enemy of the Arab world because of their friendship and allyship toward Israel. And Israel knew this. During the 1980s and 1990s, there would be foreign policy directives that were created by the Zionist government in Israel, by the later on the neoconservatives that would take shape in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that would create these directives that would implement plans to go into these countries later on to defeat the very organizations, Islamic fundamentalist organizations that they helped to create. So what I'm trying to say is that the United States didn't create these groups outright, but they helped facilitate them. Now, here's the conspiracy. Whether they knew this or not, that they knew that by using this Operation Cyclone program, that by sending these weapons and by using the ISI in Pakistan to train these people in the hopes that these would become allies, later become the enemies, so that the war machine and the sociopaths and foreign policy units would always keep the war going. Does that sound like a conspiracy to you? Or does that sound pretty reasonable? I'll let you be the judge. Bin Laden and Dr. Ayman Zawahiri would later be people who are not enemies to the United States, but I've done other live videos where I talked about the creation of Al Qaeda and where they came from. I won't do that here. I basically just wanted to talk about the general uh, history of what started the Afghan war and what came from it and what was coming during it. And I hope I didn't skip over too much. I probably did. There's a lot I could have went over, but I also didn't want to make this a very long video and bore you half to death. I figure you're here an hour and that's enough, you know. I don't want to push it. But anybody has questions, I'm also willing to answer those questions for you. I see there's 8 people here. I'll take that. To me, 8 people is a lot. And it's a subject. It's a very complex subject, a very expansive subject. And you could basically, lose a lot of people by doing it. But I want you to have an understanding of how these radical fundamentalists were created, how facilitated. And I hope I did it, you know, in a convenient way where you can understand it. I didn't want to lose you. So I hope I was successful in doing that. Um, I see Sean and Fire Pixie still here. Rick Olson, Pure Palm. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for staying and talking with me and being a part of this stream. Um, I really thank you very much for all the people that come to my streams and still have an interest in this. Listen, it's something that is important because what we're living under is a ripple effect of everything that came from events like this. And listen, the Afghan war is the longest U.S. war in history and the most expensive war in U.S. history. And just like the circle I was talking about, um, look who's taken over the country, the Taliban, the one organization that was helped to create by the Pakistan ISI and Operation Cyclone later on. And I think that's the real crime is that if you want to know who our enemies are today, in the future, find out who we're funding today. All you have to do is take a look at Ukraine and see what's going on there. But I can end the stream right now. And listen, thank you all very much for coming on. And I'll see you in the next stream. Take care.